Good morning, all, and welcome to our webcast, the MECA section webinar, OSP and what it means for you and me. Thank you for joining us. We have an hour allocated for our webinar, and we have room for questions, and we'll talk about how you can submit those in just a moment. So thank you for joining us. All right, so questions are going to be a big part of this discussion. There's a question widget in the GoToWebinar app, or I think the browser version as well. It's a drop down on the right-hand side. It looks different in different computers, but generally it's going to be a question mark or a thing that says questions. Feel free to submit questions that way, and I can direct them to the different panelists. Or you can send them via text message to 732-737-1362. I'll also put this information in the chat, so you can feel free to refer to that at any time during our discussion, or submit questions in the chat as well, and I can bring them up to the panelists. All right, if you're on social media and you are making comments or want to promote this, please use the hashtag CME chat. As well, Brian will be discussing this in just a moment, but there are plenty of resources located at www.outcomesince.org. If you press .com, it'll work as well. So feel free to reference that throughout the webinar or afterwards. And note, we will be recording this webinar and posting it on the website for reference for anyone who wasn't able to make it or would like to refer to it at another time. All right. So for those of you who are viewing as a group or viewing alone, we're just trying to get an accurate count of who is actually viewing. So if you wouldn't mind answering the poll on the right-hand side, if you're viewing this alone or viewing this as a group, we would really appreciate your votes. It looks like about half of you have voted, so if everybody else can make your vote, and then I'll go ahead and we'll find out how many folks are in a group in the next question. All right. Thanks, guys. And then if you can let me know via the next poll question what your group size is, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll just give you a few seconds to do that. All right, thanks to the big group that's out there. We really appreciate your participation. Okay, and next up, I'd like to introduce our esteemed moderator and panel and thank them all. They have endured a copious number of emails from me over the past few weeks. So Brittany Puster, she is one of my MECA section co-chairs and is with ACHL. She'll be our moderator today during the call. And then our two panelists are founding steering team members for the OSP. They're Brian McGowan, who's president of ArcMedics, and Wendy Terrell, who is with Platform Q Health. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Brian and get us started into the meat of the discussion.
So does that give me the ability to control to presenter mode, please?
I am going to hand that over to you right now.
Excellent. Excellent. And you can see my screen. Great. So a few things that we were intending to do as background for those who are familiar with the OSP. We've presented 3 or 4 different times, and in each time we've gone into depth about the background, the origin story of where the outcome standardization project came from, and the vision for the project, as well as we've reviewed and presented on our methods multiple times. All of that information is available on the website. So instead of creating individual slides or spending too much of our time today going into that background, I just direct you to outcomesince.org or .com or .net or .info. They're all directed back to this website. And on the home page, you'll be able to navigate through the vision of the outcome standardization project, as well as dig into the background, which is now 53 weeks ago, where this all kind of started at the 2018 AIS. And I would also direct your attention to the methods. I think one of the things that we've heard most loudly from the community over the past 9 or 10 months is just an understanding of how rigorous and intentional we have been in this consensus building process. And I'll kind of leave it at this. There's three, when we go through the background and we explain the origin story and the methods, there's really three important takeaways that I think keep bubbling back to the surface as either points of clarification or maybe some confusion from time to time. The Outcome Standardization Project started as and remains a fully volunteer, fully grassroots effort. But importantly, it's a volunteer and grassroots effort of scientists, of research, educational research scientists who are intending to establish and evolve this glossary for the betterment of the entire community. The qualification of the individuals who have led the steering team, who have participated in the steering team, is significant. This is not about changing the world for supporters or simplifying the world for providers. It's about establishing a foundational glossary that supports the science of educational research. And once that foundation's set, then the research scientists can evolve their methods and they can extend our branch of science. And then I think what most people recognize is that from that foundational glossary, the provider community derives significant benefit and the supporter community derives significant benefit. But we can't confuse the fact that the project itself is foundational to medical education research, and the benefits to the provider and the supporter are really secondary. The other thing, so that leaves us with multiple lenses of folks who benefit. It's not just providers, it's not just supporters, it's the fullest community. And what we've attempted to do over the last year through the steering team plans, through the one-on-one interviews, through the focus groups, and through the call for comments is to ensure that we're hearing from the broadest possible reaches of the community. And so this list on the About Us page on the website identifies everybody who has specifically contributed in some way to the evolution of the Outcome Standardization Project. And then my final thought is one area of conversation that's continued over the last 4 or 5 months is a recognition that the Outcome Standardization Project steering team is not intending, nor have we ever suggested, that we are ascribing value to the terms that are in the glossary that was released in April. We're not necessarily saying one thing is more important than another thing. It's not really in our place to make those decisions. It's the individual researchers or the individual providers or the individual supporters who can determine what they think is the most important thing to be measured or to be reported. We're simply setting a foundation that say when you're reporting or you're measuring or you're analyzing these things, if you're going to use certain terms, then we all need to agree that there's certain definitions. And so some of the questions that we get about, well, we can't do that for live meetings, maybe that's only for online, or we can't do that in a small provider, maybe only large providers can do that. None of that is necessarily true. What you do, what you can do, or you do what you think is important. And the 25 terms that are in this glossary should allow you to communicate what you are doing effectively if there are external stakeholders or even internal stakeholders. And that's a really, really important point, and may in some ways be the most important point to make on this call. So I'll leave that. When you're on the website, you can obviously click on the glossary button in the middle of the screen. The website is intended to serve almost like a wiki or Wikipedia, if you will. And so each of the 25 terms in the first version of the glossary are available on this page. And you can click on any one of them. Let's say we want to click on what is a completion. And now the completion page is there. And for those who participated, and looking at the reg list, it looks like there's many of the folks on this call right now who either participated in the interviews, the focus groups, the call for comments. You'll recognize the structure of the individual terms. So we have a definition, we have the methods that were used to make the measurement, the evidence if it exists, and periodically throughout the site, you'll see examples. We're certainly open to continuing to gather examples and to gather feedback from the community, but you should know that the steering team, as of June, will be moving into the second round and working towards the creation of the second version of the glossary. And it's our intention that while there may be some minor points of clarification and there may be some additional examples collected for the first 25 terms, we'll be principally focusing on the next 20 or 25 terms that are deemed the priorities to be standardized. So I hope that provides enough of a background. And I'll navigate back over to the homepage. And Brittany, any thoughts? Or Wendy, I think you wanted to maybe mention how you're applying some of these things as a provider.
Yes. And I also wanted to mention that we're not saying that you have to measure all of these items, and I think that's something that sometimes is a fear when people see this list. And we are sensitive to the fact that some providers are online only, online and physical live only. There's some print mixed in there. There's different approaches to how we deliver our education. And you might look at some of these and say, we can't measure that. In our grand round dinner meetings, we can't know how engaged people are. We can't count what time people are leaving the room. And that's okay. We're not saying that you have to. All that we're doing is trying to define terms for those who do measure these things. And so don't get nervous or scared if you see something on there that is beyond your capacity. Maybe you're a small organization and you can't do these things, and that's okay. But as a provider myself, my company is online only. And for us, we were counting learners the same way that this standardization project ended up netting out as counting learners. So we're not going to really have a change, but I have friends, colleagues at other companies who do have to change the way they're counting learners. So that's something we'll talk about today. We do understand that for some people, this is a change that you don't see as that is going to change your learner count in a way more negatively. So we'll talk about that when we get to the participation definitions.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate the brief background, the website information, Brian and Wendy, applications to different providers. So first question I wanted to dive into, I know you guys put together a very thorough team of researchers to help with the definitions and coming up with the lexicon. The question, though, is did the committee seek any input from audience generation partners such as Medscape, MyCME, Free and CME, et cetera, on their perspectives?
Sure. So in a couple different ways. Remember that the individual research scientists that formed the steering team committed to a model of consensus building that allowed us to create to establish some structure and then to slowly evolve the consensus over larger and larger swaths of the community. And so we started by each of the steering team members nominating 3 or 4 folks who could be interviewed for the initial one-on-ones. They were trying to set the direction of the project, establishing that the methodologies were deemed to be valid. And then we moved on to focus groups, and that was an open invitation to anyone who wanted to participate. and we had about 30 individuals participate in the focus groups from every member section in the alliance, including providers and distribution partners. And then we had the open call for comments, and that open call for comments similarly allowed larger organizations or smaller individuals to contribute. In the midst of that, we did do direct outreach to each of the distribution partners to seek their awareness and interest in contributing. And so there was direct outreach with Chris Hoffman at Medscape and Katie Lucero and the Haymarket team and the MyCME and Free CME teams. Each one of them, for this reason, as people started to comment on the focus groups and the call for comments, one of the things they suggested is, well, we're often dependent on these audience generation or distribution partners to give us the data. And so, we maintained open lines of communication. And I will say, from the Haymarket, MyCME, and Medscape, I will specifically commend not only on their contribution and one-on-one individual contributions by several of their team members, but also their contribution in the call for comments. I think they get it. They understand that while not every one of these terms may have been the way they were doing and using them in the past, in many cases, let's say 80% of the terms were identical to what they were doing, and they understand there's a small change that needs to be made on some others. But I think the commitment to the broader goal, which is, there is no, prior to last May, I think the feeling that everybody got is that there was no objectivity in the way we phrase the approaches that we use and the way we report data. And so Wendy and I share this anecdote all the time. There are individuals on the steering team who were definitive in their perspective of how something should be measured or what something means. And they would get 15 or 20 minutes into their statement of absolute certainty, only to have 3 other people on the steering team call say, yeah, not so fast. That's not the way I've been doing it. And I've been doing it for 15 years. And so we very quickly got rid of any pride in what we thought coming to the table. I don't know, Wendy, some of those conversations were fun. Some of them were painful.
Right. But to the point of this question, so we're all, MECs on this call, apparently. So yes, we work with Free CME, MyCME, these companies, they have our programs. They need to be on the same page as us if we're going to be reporting the numbers, right? So we've been in that situation with some of these groups, trying to get transparency about what do you count as a learner? Are you counting people that just saw Front Matter? And there's been discrepancies, so we've had to work that out. So I believe that's what this question was getting to.
Absolutely. No, I think that's extremely helpful. That's been a challenge, as we know, as MECs, when you're reporting different numbers. Every company has different definitions and standards, and it's been the MEC's responsibility to interpret those, and I'm sure across the MECs that is all different on how we're presenting those numbers. To have that standardization, I think, will help us, especially in the eyes of the supporters, when we're all reporting the same number. Mm-hmm. We did get a few questions from the audience. This kind of dovetails on that in all the partners that were involved in this. This is more partner buy-in, but has this glossary been endorsed by any of the major organizations within our industry, such as the Alliance, ACCME, et cetera?
There are conversations in the works. If we go back a year ago, the plan was to move swiftly and to do it as a volunteer effort. And so as early as June of last year, I had multiple conversations with the Alliance leadership, with Steve Kolchak, then president, and with Laurie Kendall Ellis. And there was an agreement that for us to do this at the pace that it needed to be done, then it was probably better for us to do it in that volunteer grassroots approach. And then there's been ongoing conversations with the Alliance since then to ensure that they're fully aware of where we are, and that at some point when we had established the glossary and this group of volunteer scientists had established some credibility as to the methods that were being applied and as to the awareness in the community that maybe it would be a good time for the Alliance to come back to the table and decide on whether this is something that needs to be endorsed. But and certainly because we were grassroots and volunteer and had to establish credibility of our methods, reaching out to groups like CMSS and ACCME in the first year where we really had no track record didn't necessarily seem to be that valuable of a use of time. But keep in mind that the Alliance is a member organization that serves the members. They don't establish the science. The science is established by the scientists. And so the requirements for this to be an endorsed program from the beginning is kind of putting the cart before the horse. What we have now is we have a process and we have some credibility, significant credibility within the community, and we've got methods in place. And we know the labor that goes into it, and we know that we could accomplish everything we've accomplished with no additional staff time. And you know, aside from the $7 a month I'm paying for the website, there's no real expenditure. And so, you know, it's important that from a perspective of advocacy and dissemination, that the Alliance could play a significant role there. And actually, Phil Dombrowski, the current president, who may be on the call now, he and I are chatting next Tuesday to that end, is to try to figure out if it's now time for the Alliance to step back in and what role may the Alliance play in this. But we had to establish the credibility and the methods first and just make sure this wasn't some pipe dream from last May that never got executed on.
Great, thanks, Brian. That's definitely understandable.
And Brittany, I'm sorry, the one other thing I'll say is the steering team has had multiple conversations with organizations across the industry, both on the provider side and on the supporter side. And right now there's probably about 8 to 10 supporters and probably more than a dozen providers who are having internal conversations about the official endorsement of the project. I don't know what structure that's going to take. What we had suggested to them in these conversations is maybe we add another menu item at the top of that web page that you're showing that basically says endorsements. And on that website, if an organization wants to endorse it, then their logo and maybe a testimonial about how they're applying the glossary could be placed on that. But the steering team, Wendy, I don't believe we have a legal team. We don't have much of an HR team as far as the steering team goes. So we're being a little cautious in what endorsing really means. It's a publication will probably be out late July. I've talked to a publisher of several journals last week, and they've requested that an article be fast-tracked. And so between the website and a peer-reviewed publication, the science is established. Now, the organizational endorsements could take a million different flavors, but again, that's not on us to try to figure that out.
Thank you, Brian. Going back to the lexicon and the proposed definitions that you have, so it does not appear that the online learner who views the front matter and clicks start has been defined. This action, as we know, does show some interest by the clinician if they do start the activity. And the question is, why have they not been defined within your lexicon?
We started with a list of over 100 terms that could be standardized and prioritized. We divided that up amongst the steering team, and everybody identified 15 or 20 that they wanted to take the first crack at, building out the evidence and centralizing the information that was required to standardize it. That first approach to taking 15 to 20 terms was taking each of us 8-10 hours to kind of go through the initial terms. And more terms got added, and so we ended up with over 100. And then at that point, the steering team, this is probably last July, early August, made a decision that for the glossary to be consumable and not overwhelming, we had to start a little bit smaller. And so there are a discrete set of terms that have been standardized at this point, and there are many more that could be. We tried to focus on the ones that we had all experienced were the most confusing. and created the most redundancy in the work that people had to do to try to make everybody happy. And so we scaled it back. So we started here. Now, the other part of your question is that specific, and can you just read that opening sentence again, that specific item or that specific experience?
So the learner who starts, views the front matter and click start.
What are they clicking start on?
Start activity.
Okay, so if they're so this is and Wendy, feel free. These are the conversations that we have forever. So there were two really critical arguments that we had as a steering team and that worked through the focus groups and the call for comments. And we'll table participant for now, because it's kind of, in some ways it's trivial, in some ways it's also the thing that gets discussed the most. But the concept of start and learner and the concept of completion and completer. It is absolutely true that there are healthcare providers who look at the front matter and they start to build on their learning experience. They're starting to evolve their schema. They're starting to understand what is or isn't in this educational experience. And then they get to a pretest, which may be the next step in some instances, and they answer some questions. And they're absolutely true that there is some learning that probably is occurring as someone's going through those steps. But if you compare the intention of the front matter and the pretest and the gain, if you will, between what they're trying to do with those pieces and the actual learning that takes place, it seemed like the cleanest way to define a start and therefore define a learner is at the beginning of the educational content exposure. And so through the consensus, what we said is and there's actually even some additional contextual information on those definition pages that says we're not saying that no learning happens beforehand, but if we continue down this vague path of I want to justify front matter as being a start because it makes my click rate go up versus I want to define an exposure to the educational content as a start, it just seems like it's far more rigorous to use the latter definition. And we did the same thing. Go ahead, Wendy.
Yeah. I was going to say everybody's flow is different. So, and please note with respect to people that have more physical live meetings, we're really talking about online here. You know, some people might press a start activity button that you just referred to, and it leads them to a pretest. Some people, it might lead them to a video. We can't make a blanket statement about what's what when everyone's got a different educational flow. Doesn't mean you can't report these things in your reports or to your supporters. Certainly report them. You want to draw a funnel or, you know, a little graph that shows you had this many people with front matter and this many people, you know, at your pretest. Great, report it. We just didn't choose to find these like every step of the way in this glossary. We had to draw a line in the sand and say this is where a learner is, and it wasn't just us, it was based on the consensus of all these people in the focus groups and what most people that we heard from agreed on. So it doesn't mean that these aren't important points in your process and in the educational experience of learners. Certainly report them. You know, we just had to, you know, we had to make decisions about what we were going to define and what we weren't.
And I think that probably already answers our next question of why not define the clinician who takes the post-test and eval. The same set of
for the completers and completion side, and again, there were lengthy conversations around this. I think in the CME community, especially in the accredited CME community, not just in continuing medical education, but this kind of cottage industry that we're in, we tend to think about education from the educator's perspective or even from the accreditor's perspective. And it's just misaligned with what learning science would suggest. There are absolutely individuals who go to some educational activity and they're there to answer a few questions, or they're there because the first part of the content or the first learning objective is relevant to them. and they don't need to complete an educational intervention. They certainly don't need to request credit, but we shouldn't devalue those individuals. And so by using the starting line at exposure to the educational content, we're basically saying now all of those individuals who have different goals for their learning journey can be counted. And some of them will complete it, and that's great. We can draw that line in the sand, and some of them can request credit. That's great. We can draw that line in the sand. But we can't make the learning experience about credit or about completing some arbitrary length at educational activity. It really has to be about the individual healthcare provider who's looking to learn.
Thank you, Brian. I have a couple more questions from the audience. One of them, do you think we will ever get to a point where outcomes are measured one way in oncology, another way in diabetes, another way in cardiology, that we're looking at different therapeutic areas and applying different outcomes methodologies to those therapeutic areas?
I think that, the evaluation approaches you take for your activities are really your decision, and we're not dictating those once again. I think that's a question that is an interesting question, but maybe separate to these definitions in the glossary. My personal opinion as an evaluator, yes. I customize evaluations for different programs, and I don't know, like the therapeutic question, I think maybe, that's a different discussion completely. I see more like to what type of activity it was and what the learning objectives were, perhaps.
Yep. And another question from our audience, how are supporters who are involved in this project using the glossary? Ryan, you alluded to that a bit earlier and maybe putting those endorsements up there, but also are those supporters updating their grants portals or outcomes requirements to use the glossary terms?
Yeah, there's 3 or 4 case studies front of mind. I believe Sue McGinnis shared with us on the steering team that they will be putting a link to the glossary to the website on their front part of their grant management website. It's basically saying, make sure you're aware that this is out there and that this is that we're kind of committed to these definitions. A few other supporters have they have a playbook that they're ready to roll out. I've heard on a couple different occasions, and that playbook's any place from a splash page on the grant management system to altering the grant application forms. So there's contextual help when you forecast how many learners you're going to reach. There's a little icon there that'll say a learner means this. And so it's supportive in the grant management systems, and others have also described that they're doing the same thing on the reconciliation side. And so I think over time, you'll find some supporters are just extending awareness and saying, make sure you use these definitions. And there's one supporter who's actually already has, I believe, they already have the language approved through their legal team to actually write into the letters of agreement that these are the terms that we expect to be reported on, or these are the terms we expect you to use, or the definitions we expect you to use when you're doing your reporting.
And Brian, we had also heard at least one report of the grant management system vendor was not able to change the term, at least yet. So sometimes there might be the desire to use the word learner, for example, but the vendor has participant and they have to jump through a few hoops to get that changed.
Yep.
What about those supporters who are not familiar with OSP? What strategies should we as the community take to reposition the value add of the online learning? For example, where definition of success for an activity used to be 3,000 learners, now it's 1,000 learners. And do you think this redefinition of learners calls for a new pricing benchmark on the value of online education? An example, if a supporter previously targeted a cost per learner of $50 to $75, does that expectation need to shift up?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's a lot of ways to demonstrate value to supporters, and how many people view your program is one, but also making an impact, the behavioral impact that we've all evolved with our outcomes measurement, and we're measuring at such a higher level now. I think it's definitely a conversation to have to talk about different ways to demonstrate value. Also, we're not sure yet that this is going to be a real huge change in cost per learner. That's really to be determined. Perhaps it will. But what was happening before is there were many providers that were measuring learners as folks that actually viewed their program. And so it really wasn't a fair playing field to have people, some people measuring this way and some people measuring that way, but we're all using, the word participant. And there was a bit of smoke and mirrors going on with, some vendors and some providers, like not really defining what we meant by these terms. So this is just getting rid of the smoke and mirrors and making sure that there's more transparency. That I think the whole field is moving towards more transparency, and I think it's only fair that we all count in the same way when we're reporting to the supporters. So I don't think this is, it's really to be determined. I can't say what's going to happen, but I think that most supporters appreciate the transparency and knowing where the numbers are coming from that they're receiving.
And your point about maybe supporters who aren't aware of it, there's a couple supporters who aren't on the steering team, but have kind of created a channel to make sure that the information's getting out to the smaller supporters. Riaz, for example, has identified 15 or 20 organizations through the IACE member section that he's aware of. They're new to support, or the individuals in those positions are new to support. They're new grants offices. And so from time to time, he has reached out to those individuals to get the word out. And he's also sent all of that contact information to the steering team. So in our outreach, I have a sense on the supporter side that it's pretty broad reaching. In fact, at the AIS meeting last week, the first question we asked from the podium was, raise your hand if you're aware of the OSP, and it was at least 80% of that room that raised their hand that they're aware of it. The second question we asked is, raise your hand if you've read or downloaded the glossary, and that was about 30% of the room, 30 to 40% of the room. So that's over 100 folks, or about 100 folks that have actually dug into it. And then the third question we asked was, if you have read it, have you started to work on how you might employ it or changes you may make? And there was a smattering of those folks. We know from the grant website, there's a couple places you can go and subscribe to the website, and you can download the glossary from the website. And so that's actually kind of building out a mailing list, if you will, for folks who want to continue to get updated. And I think we've hit over 100 individuals that have subscribed to the OSP project for us to continue to do some outreach with. And we continue this kind of advocacy. So this is the fourth or fifth presentation that we've given to the community about the glossary, both in the terminal planning stages and since it's been launched. So, and I think it was mentioned earlier that this recording will be made available. So we're gonna put a page up on the OSP website where people can be directed to download or to access this copy as well. But if you go to the blog pages on the OSP website, you can actually see both of the CME Palooza sessions that have been embedded in separate blog posts.
Thank you, Brian. And you mentioned at AIS that a few of the different stakeholders have started implementing some of the lexicon. What about the other stakeholders? What barriers do you expect to get full adoption in the definitions that you've proposed among supporters, MECs, academic partners, audience generation partners, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other question kind of touched on that. There are folks who counted more liberally what a learner was, or back then we would call it a participant. And there were folks that were more conservative in their counts. So, of course, the folks that counted on the more liberal end of the continuum are not as thrilled with this change because it's going to hurt their numbers. But it's getting everyone on the same playing field, as we already said. And sure, there's the possibility that some supporters who have to justify to their stakeholders in their own organizations, and we're used to saying for the year we hit X number of people, now they have to have a lower number, but there are ways that they could frame data there are ways that we could help them with that story by highlighting some of our fabulous outcomes data, talking about impact more. And I think that we've all gotten much better at helping supporters frame that story in a way that will make that job easier for them to justify internally.
Yeah,
I agree.
I don't think there's anyone on this call who hasn't heard the "it takes 17 years for a guideline to become best practice" language. Like, in many respects, none of us should expect this to happen overnight, because we're standardizing a language that people have been married to their own definitions for well more than a decade. I've been doing this for close to 20 years, and people have been married to definitions largely with their head in the sand and not actively communicating about the challenges. Now, over the last 8 or 9 years, the problem has grown and it's gotten worse and worse, and the pain has gotten worse and worse for a lot of different individuals. And so I think when the steering team kind of reflects on what we already know is happening, we're thrilled with the idea that there's providers and supporters that are going to begin to apply this. And on the research side, I think there's numerous opportunities for us to continue to advance it. But change doesn't usually happen in science overnight. It's just when GLEVAC came out, it changed in a year. But when a vaccine guideline comes out, it often takes 5 or 7 years. Hoping we're closer to the GLEVAC form of adoption than we are to the hypertension form of adoption. But the community's certainly shifting, and they're shifting, I think, at a rate faster than we expected.
Well, I have to commend the OSP advisory team for leveling the playing field, and also use this as a call for action that anybody who is adopting the definitions, the lexicon, that they go out and educate who they're presenting this to. They're not just putting it in their language. They're not just putting it into their outcomes reports, but providing background on why we're doing this, why those numbers may have shifted, because they are now a true reflection of those learners, participants, completers, etc. And hopefully this will standardize the outcomes across the industry, and we're not seeing huge numbers, outliers, and we're not also seeing people who are trying to, set the bar or be the pioneer, because being the pioneer is very hard when you're going out and you're actually reporting those true numbers, and everybody else is maybe reporting a number that's a bit more inflated. So I definitely commend you and the team for doing that.
Thank you.
While, again, going on that, while the intention around this project is consistency with the terminology, which has its benefits, as I alluded to, are there any concerns for the reasons that we have talked about that the effort might influence CME funding negatively if we fail to simultaneously define value for commercial supporters?
Are there concerns? Like I just alluded to before, I feel that it's our responsibility to help supporters frame a story where they'll be able to advocate effectively internally to, either keep or increase our funding. I don't, and it's also still to be determined whether this is going to be a huge fall. I mean, like I said, there are plenty of companies that were already counting like this. So I don't know if this is going to be some dramatic decline in cost per learner across the board, like some people might think. We'll really wait and see. So, and I mean, are there that many people that looked at front matter and learning objectives or took a pretest and suddenly left? Is there that dramatic a change? I mean, I'd like to hear. Maybe there is, but that's not for every company. So I don't foresee some doom and gloom future.
And we certainly have not heard any concern. The occasional anecdote around, we've been. A supporter saying we've been funding this one project for the last 4 or 5 years, and I've always questioned whether their numbers have an extra comma in them or not. And given these definitions, I'm really interested to see what they come back with next week or next year for that grant application. they're also wise enough to say, well, the educational value that they were deriving, they were never really counting the 3,000 number because they didn't think it was accurate. They were focusing on the outcomes report that they were getting, and they were pleased with it. And so they're interested to see if the numbers, those top line numbers, change. But they were always discounting that anyway to kind of focus on a number that's a little bit more legitimate. Just the caution again that this is about establishing the foundational science, ensuring that everyone's on the same page. It's unlikely that there's going to be significant flux in this unique supporter-provider world that we all kind of live in. But there's really no question that the underlying taxonomy had to be standardized. And, in the next 6 months or 12 months, if there's a little bit of flux, I would expect it to be minor at most. But we maintain conversations through all the steering team members to try to figure out how this is being applied so that we can adapt and evolve moving forward.
Thank you. And I have another question from the audience. If this is an all-volunteer effort, is it sustainable? And has there been idea about soliciting funding or financial support to maintain OSP?
Is it sustainable? Wendy, Jason, Greg, Karen, Anthea, and I are committed to this. There's been no wavering. We've put in hundreds and hundreds of hours, and we all see the greater good. Does that mean 3 years from now it's going to be the 7 of us doing it? Very unlikely. I think 2019, 2020, we will probably, again, it's grassroots, so we don't have like a formal legacy program where people get replaced and moved on.
Volunteer.
So, we're absolutely looking for volunteers in the interviews, the focus groups, and then as the time progresses, to start slotting in new steering team members as people move on and move out. But I think 2 years of this steering team is going to have a strong enough foundation. And we've also discussed, by the way, totally on the table, is once it's established, the entire OSP could be handed off to the Alliance to run as a task force or a committee. Now that the science is established, the methods are established, we got where we needed to go. It's pretty much a turnkey system now, as long as they're ensuring that there are research scientists in those steering team roles that are keeping on top of the vision of the project. I'm more than happy to change my email address on the website to Phil Dombrowski at wentzmiller.com and let the Alliance take it over when the time's right. And
that would be wonderful.
Brittany, the one thing I will add is many of the folks on the call kind of know that I don't intentionally do much ex-US stuff. I've somehow been successfully able to avoid ex-US or global in every role that I've had, including leading at Wyeth and senior director at Pfizer. I've been able to avoid it. That being said, the Europeans are hungry, and so I've received multiple phone calls and emails from our colleagues across the pond, and I'm actually sitting down with 1 or 2 of them on Wednesday to potentially ensure that those voices are being heard. Now, what we've heard so far is that they believe that the OSP glossary, because it's foundationally about the science, they believe that it is absolutely portable, although the variation globally is far more significant than it is in the US. They believe that they'll actually, it would be a very, very valuable thing for them to take the torch and start running with the torch. Whether that means there's a global steering team that's in conjunction with the existing outcome steering team, or whether we ensure that there's always some global voice that's brought to bear moving forward, I don't know that yet. I may know more Wednesday or Thursday of next week.
Global domination, your ultimate goal. We talked about this earlier in terms of the recruitment partners and seeking their feedback as you were developing this language. Were there any stakeholders that you felt should have been involved in the process that may not have been?
In numbers, yes. So we heard from every stakeholder group. In the focus groups, we had one focus group call that had 3 supporters, 3 hospital providers, some small not-profit associations, all represented. But the number isn't necessarily the kind of proportions of the different stakeholder groups probably isn't where we'd want it to be, right? But for good reason. The pain of the lack of standardization is often not felt at the level of a very small society, a state society, or a small healthcare and hospital system. They don't necessarily have frequent external reporting requirements, and internally, whatever definitions they've been using, they're pretty much able to use because they're standardized within their own institution. The challenge becomes when you start to collaborate or when you start to do broader science, publishable science, and certainly if you're getting commercial support. And just like I said, Riaz was kind of serving as a liaison. John Junkowitz was also doing that, and so he had intended to reach out and I believe had communicated with a bunch of the smaller state or healthcare systems operating accreditation offices. But we try to cast as large of a call for volunteers and call for comments as we can, but I don't know that those smaller groups are as motivated to dedicate the time and energy to respond or participate. At least that's been the finding so far.
We have about 8 minutes left. We've answered a majority of the questions. I think at this point in time, I'd solicit any other questions from our audience. Otherwise, Brian, Wendy, any closing comments, thoughts?
For me, I think that this is going to be positive overall. We've heard overwhelmingly from supporters that they've wanted some standardization for years. I haven't spoken to a supporter that's unhappy about this. So, Brian, maybe you have, but I feel like it's only fair that we're all on the same page and that we're all counting the same way. And, I know we focus so much on participation since that seems to be what everyone else is responding to, but this is going to move on to other terms. This is going to help us, with our outcomes terms beyond participation, other levels. This will help us understand, different types of steps and methodology for measurement. So hopefully we'll be able to move on to participation once everyone is agreed. And I think, I hope that you'll get on board and let us know your feedback privately if you're more comfortable that way. Thank you.
And Wendy, to that point, what are the next steps for OSP?
So we had a lot of terms that we were looking at, and just to, we decided to do it in phases, therefore, or it would have taken forever if we got through this huge list. And just like there was a methodology for defining the terms, there was a methodology for even identifying what terms folks want defined and want to be on the same page with. So we have some that we just didn't get to, which will be a phase 2 after this initial dissemination is done. And Brian, any future plans beyond that? He talked about European and.
Oh, I would imagine, the vision right now is every 6 months there's a new release. And it's kind of like open software kind of model where we work through it. We work through the same process. We go through interviews, have a couple focus groups, really test out the prioritization, the terms, and the definitions. There's opportunities with some of the grant management systems to help them integrate these definitions from the OSP directly into their software. So there's different API that can be built out. So as the definitions come up, everyone's software gets updated simultaneously. But we're new at this, right? So we're just starting. But the safest thing to say is every 6 months there'll be a new glossary. I think that we've established, and the website hopefully won't crash anytime soon.
Wonderful. Last question. If the OSP OSP proceeds in defining assessment methods, how can we assure innovation in assessment in the future?
We're not telling
We've got about
anybody
4 minutes.
Right. So we're not telling anybody how to measure, how to assess. That's not our goal. All that we're doing is defining some terms that people use across the board, across most of our MECs and other providers outside of the MEC subgroup. So we're not dictating how you should measure, how you should evaluate at all. Not our goal.
Yeah, I can't imagine that standardizing a taxonomy stifles innovation. If anything, it just establishes a foundation from which people can take logical steps forward.
Brian, Wendy, and the OSP team, we thank you for leading this initiative, leveling the playing field, the opportunity to ask you these questions. I thank all of the MECA members who are able to join us in our session today. Please continue to send the co-chairs, Alice and myself, or Caroline, any questions. We will field those to Brian and Wendy, and hopefully we can have an ongoing discussion, send that out in email form, perhaps even answer that in the OSP blog. But we do appreciate everybody's time today and look forward to the continued updates every 6 months. I encourage everybody to go to the OSP site, download those definitions, familiarize yourself, and hopefully together as a community we can move forward in standardizing our outcomes definitions. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As well, I just want to mention that a recording of this will be made available at outcomesince.org as soon as possible, and I'll send out an email that lets you guys know when that's ready. Thank you so much, and everyone have a happy Friday.
Thank you all.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.